Everyone in Lane 4 knew that Frank Johnson was a perfectionist. His lawn was never a half-inch too long, and his house, well, it was the quietest place in all of Crestwood, Ohio. But on a humid Tuesday night in 1998, Frank's wife, Martha, realized that the silence she had lived in for 20 years wasn't silence at all. It was a hum. A low, electric thrumming coming from behind a double-locked oak door that Frank hadn't opened in 2 decades. And as she pressed her ear against the wood, she didn't hear the sound of old blueprints or dusty archives. She heard the sound of something breathing. But it wasn't the breath of a human. It sounded like metal grinding against bone. Today, we're going to tell you a story that defies every law of logic, and proves that sometimes, a father's love can be the most terrifying thing on earth. They say that in suburban America, silence isn't just peace. Silence is a form of currency. The quieter your home, the more successful you appear to your neighbors. And in the town of Crestwood, Ohio, in the summer of 1998, no one was wealthier in silence than the Johnsons. Frank Johnson was a man built of steel and blueprints. As a high-end architect, he was the one who designed the very skyscrapers that shaped this state's skyline. His wife, Martha, was the heartbeat of the local church choir. And then, there was their son, Marcus. To the outside world, Marcus was a ghost of a legend. The neighbors remembered him as a brilliant child, a prodigy who had reportedly left for a prestigious boarding school in Europe years ago. But, as the sun set over the perfectly manicured lawns of Crestwood, a strange phenomenon began to occur. It started with the birds. Every time they landed on the roof of the Johnson residence, they would suddenly scatter in a panic. As if an invisible vibration was shaking every single timber in that house. Then came the power surges. Every night, at exactly 3:14 in the morning, the streetlights on Lane 4 would flicker for precisely 12 seconds. The neighbors, mostly retired engineers and veterans who noticed everything, began to talk. "It's not a substation issue," Old Man Miller would say from his porch. "It's coming from that Victorian at the end of the road." Hashtag 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 hashtag. Inside that house, Frank Johnson sat behind a door that had no business being in a residential home. It was reinforced oak, lined with lead, and fitted with a biometric lock that cost more than a brand new sedan. Martha never asked what was behind it. In their world, you didn't ask questions that might shatter the perfect reflection in the mirror. However, one night, Martha heard it. It wasn't a human sound. It was a mechanical hiss, followed by a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat. Asterisk thump. Whir. Thump. Whir, asterisk. The logic began to crumble. If this was an architectural archive, why did the room need industrial-grade cooling? Why was Frank hauling oxygen tanks in there in the middle of the night? Tension began to spill out into the streets. The neighbors weren't just whispering anymore. They started gathering at the end of the sidewalk. This wasn't a protest with picket signs, it was a protest in the form of a cold, hard suspicion. They demanded answers. Why did the quietest house in town suddenly sound like a factory that was breathing? Frank faced them on the front lawn. He smiled, the same smile he used when winning million-dollar contracts. But his eyes showed something else. Something deeply touching, yet utterly terrifying. "Everything is fine," he said in a hauntingly calm voice. "I'm just working on my final project. Something that will bring back what we all lost." Hashtag 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 hashtag. Weeks passed, and the silence on Lane 4 was no longer a luxury, it was a threat. A sharp scent of ozone and hospital-grade cleaners began to leak from the vents of the Johnson home. Dogs in the neighborhood refused to walk past their sidewalk. They would whimper, tails tucked between their legs, as if they sensed something at a frequency human ears couldn't hear. Old Man Miller, the veteran, couldn't stay silent any longer. To him, there was a fine line between privacy and public danger. He organized small meetings in his garage. 5 men, all over the age of 50, sat around a wooden table under a dim neon light. "Frank isn't the man we knew," Miller whispered. "He brought a wooden crate into that house last week. It was labeled emergency medical equipment. Since when does an architect need an industrial defibrillator in his study?" This unrest peaked into action. It was a classic suburban American protest, cold, measured, yet lethal. They stopped inviting Martha to tea. They stopped acknowledging Frank's morning waves. And finally, they reported illegal activities endangering the environment to the authorities. But behind that cold oak door, Frank was on his knees. Tears fell onto a sterile metal floor. He wasn't building a weapon. He wasn't conducting a malicious experiment. He was holding a hand. The hand was warm, it felt like human skin, but if you listened closely enough, you could hear the sound of tiny gears turning behind the wrist. "Just a little longer, Marcus," Frank whispered, his voice raspy from months of sleep deprivation. "Daddy is going to give you your 10th birthday, for the second time." Logic had been dead for a long time here. Frank knew, medically, that his son had been cremated 20 years ago after a tragic accident on a frozen lake. But as an architect, Frank believed that if you have the right structure, if you have strong enough materials, you can rebuild anything. Even a soul. Hashtag. That night, the rain poured down in Ohio. Lightning flashed, illuminating the Johnson house standing stiff like a massive tombstone. Outside, the blue and red lights of police cruisers reflected off the neighbors' windows. The neighborhood protest had worked. The police arrived with a search warrant, citing suspicion of hazardous chemical storage. The people of Crestwood stood under their umbrellas, watching from a distance. There was a sense of satisfaction, but also a deep, deep fear. They wanted to see Frank fall, but they weren't ready for what he was hiding. As the firefighters slammed a hydraulic ram into that oak door, Frank just stood in the corner of the room. He didn't fight. He just stared at a small bed in the center of the room, covered in electrode wires. The door burst open with a deafening metallic thud. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn. But suddenly, they stopped. One officer dropped his flashlight. In the middle of that room was a young boy. Marcus. He looked exactly like the photo in the living room, but he hadn't aged a single day. His eyes were open, a clear, bright blue, staring at the ceiling with a beautiful emptiness. "Frank?" the sheriff asked with a trembling voice. "What have you done?" Frank didn't answer the officer. He stared out the window at the crowd of neighbors watching in horror. "You want to know my secret?" Frank screamed, his voice breaking from 2 decades of suppressed agony. "You all live with rotting memories. You lose the ones you love and you just cry. I didn't. I rebuilt him. I fixed it. Hashtag. But here is the part that will make your skin crawl." As the officers tried to touch the boy, Frank shrieked, "Don't. He's not fully connected yet." Suddenly, the power in the entire town of Crestwood went out. A massive electromagnetic pulse exploded from the room. And in that total darkness, a voice was heard. It wasn't Frank. It wasn't the police. It was the voice of a small child. "Daddy." The voice echoed, but it didn't come from the boy on the bed. The voice came from an old Zenith radio in the corner of the room. And here is the plot twist. The officers realized something terrifying. The boy on the bed was just an empty shell, a lifeless architectural robot. But Marcus's consciousness, his soul, had somehow moved into the radio frequency of the house years ago. And all this time, Marcus had been manipulating Frank. Marcus was the one ordering his father to build a new body so he could return. Frank wasn't the creator, he was just a prisoner of his own son's ghost, who refused to let go. As the police dragged Frank out, they heard Marcus whispering through every electronic device in the house. "Don't leave, Daddy, we're almost done. Hashtag 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 hashtag. We need to stop for a moment, and listen to what the people on Lane 4 were saying. Because in every mystery, the neighbors are the most honest witnesses, and the most terrified. Take Mrs. Higgins, a 70-year-old widow who lived right next door to the Johnsons. For 10 years, she watched Frank go out every morning to get the paper. She noticed that Frank never seemed to age. The wrinkles on his face seemed frozen in time since the day Marcus was declared missing. Mrs. Higgins gave her statement to the police a week before the raid. Her voice shook as she described what she saw through her kitchen window on a cold winter night. "I saw Frank in the backyard," Mrs. Higgins whispered. "He wasn't gardening. He was digging, but not a hole for plants. He was planting cables. Thick copper wires running from underground, into the foundation of his house. He was talking to the ground, as if someone was listening down there." Then there was Bill, a former city electrical technician. Bill was the first to realize the power surges on Lane 4 made no mathematical sense. He calculated that the Johnson house was pulling enough juice to power a small hospital wing. "I tried knocking on his door once," Bill said. "I wanted to offer help, thinking there was a major short circuit. Frank opened the door just a crack, just enough for me to glimpse into the hallway. And God is my witness. I swear I saw the walls moving. Not from a vibration, but as if the walls were breathing. There were pulses of blue light crawling behind the wallpaper. These testimonies are what fueled that protest. It wasn't a protest of anger, but a protest born of pure, unadulterated dread. The people of Crestwood felt their homes were no longer safe, because their neighbor was doing something that defied the laws of nature. Hashtag 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 hashtag. Let's go back to the moment that door was breached. We need to understand what the officers saw as they stepped past the threshold of that oak door. The floor was no longer wood or carpet. Frank had replaced it with soundproofed steel plates. Along the walls were glass jars filled with clear liquid. Inside were organs printed in 3 dimensions. Synthetic hearts, lungs pulsing slowly due to external air pumps, and neural networks that looked like silver spiderwebs. Human logic would call this a madman's lab. But to Frank, this was a temple. Frank stood in the middle of that labyrinth of wires, clutching an old remote control. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. As the sheriff approached, Frank raised his hands. "You think I'm crazy?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper, like a breeze. "You all throw away the things of the ones you love when they die. You donate their clothes, you delete their phone numbers, you kill them a second time because you want to move on. Frank laughed softly, a sound more haunting than a scream. I didn't. I saved every strand of Marcus's hair. I saved every recording of his voice. I studied every brainwave pattern ever recorded when he took those IQ tests at school. I didn't just build his body. I rebuilt his world. This is where we see the most heart-wrenching side of it. Frank didn't just build a robot. He built a life support system integrated into the entire house. The house was Marcus. The furnace was his body temperature. The lights were his brain activity. And that humming sound the neighbors heard was Marcus trying to speak. Hashtag 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 hashtag. After the raid that night, Frank was led away in handcuffs. He didn't resist. He just kept staring at the second-floor window, at the room that was now dark. The government came in with special teams. They dismantled all the illegal medical equipment. They cut the wires buried underground. They took the shell of Marcus and put it in a metal crate to be examined at a secret facility. The people of Crestwood went back to their homes. They thought the nightmare was over. Old Man Miller went back to his porch. Mrs. Higgins went back to making tea. However, a month after the house was emptied, Miller noticed something. Every night, at exactly 3:14 in the morning, the streetlights on Lane 4 still flicker. For precisely 12 seconds. And if you walk past the empty Johnson house, you won't hear the sound of machines anymore. But, if you press your ear against the front door that is now boarded shut, you will hear the voice of a small child, very faint, coming from behind the walls. Daddy. A moment of silence. Daddy, it's dark in here. It turns out, Frank was right about one thing. He had successfully moved his son's consciousness. But he made a fatal error in his architectural calculations. He didn't build a body, he built an eternal prison. Marcus didn't return to the real world, he was trapped inside the circuits of the house itself. Forever. And therein lies the most painful truth for people like us. Sometimes, a love that is too great can become the most horrific form of torture.